next speaker is Agnieszka Janik. Maybe while we are doing some technical things here, yeah, I can introduce Agnieszka. Agnieszka Janik got a diploma in psychology at the Birkbeck College, University of London, Faculty of Continuing Education in 2006. At the Birkbeck College, she also got her bachelor in psychology in 2009 and the master in cognitive neuroscience in 2011. Agnieszka Janik wrote her dissertation on wider perceptual traits associated with synesthesia and the role of cortical oscillations in Gestalt processing. Between November 2011 and July 2012, she was a research assistant at the Goldsmiths College. Currently, Agnieszka Janik is an Economic and Social Research Council-funded PhD student in the Department of Psychology at the Goldsmiths College of London. The main focus of her doctoral thesis is on the neurocognitive basis of synesthesia and its implications for social cognition and cross-modal interactions in perception. In her research, she implements electrophysiological techniques, non-invasive brain stimulation, and psychophysics to explore these relations. Today, Agnieszka will talk about a very interesting topic. Her presentation is called Synesthesia for Color is linked to reduced motion perception. Yeah. Yes, no problem.
Yeah, but now it's going to go to. It's going to go to. Sorry, I guess this got unplugged and.
Can you hear me? Oh, not really. So thank you very much for your introduction, and I also wanted to thank the organizers for putting this great event together and for inviting me here. So let me just get my presentation, 1 second. Okay, so the focus of my presentation is on the motion perception abilities in synesthesia. And in particular, I'll be talking about synesthesia for color. Now, some of the synesthetes here with other forms of synesthesia might get a bit upset because it seems that most studies in neuroscience and psychology are done on synesthesia for color, but this is simply, as it was indicated before, it is the most common form of synesthesia, and therefore we have better access to people with this type of synesthesia. So this will be a neuroscientific account of this particular aspect of synesthesia, and I'm not going to go into too much detail regarding the definitions or the theories about synesthesia, because it has been mentioned a number of times over the last 2 days, especially yesterday. I'll just very briefly mention that sort of the working definition of synesthesia that I use is that synesthesia is this rare condition which occurs in about 4% of the population, and this is according to the Julius Simner's study from 2006. And this is taking all different types of synesthesia together. And in synesthesia, you've got one property of the stimulus called the inducer, which induces another property of that stimulus, which typically is not associated with the first. So for example, in grapheme color synesthesia, we have achromatic graphemes, numbers or letters, which are called the inducers, which trigger the secondary percept of color called the concurrent. The two major theories of synesthesia are the structural and functional theory. So the structural theory suggests that there's increased number of connections in the brain, especially between the inducer and concurrent brain areas. The functional theory suggests that there is lack of inhibition between multisensory and sensory-specific brain areas. Due to the complex nature of synesthesia, as has been discussed in great detail over the last 2 days, especially the fact that it's so idiosyncratic and subjective, and that these synesthetic experiences are so difficult to describe and verbalize and sort of put down and accurately express them in any form. The first researchers who have became interested in synesthesia had a very, very hard time. They could only use interviews or subjective reports. That's why the field was pretty much abandoned for many, many years. But thanks to the development within the field of psychology, as well as birth of neuroscience, also advancements in terms of neuroimaging techniques such as EEG or fMRI, brain stimulation techniques, and different psychological experimental paradigms such as Stroop task or visual search task, also described yesterday. We can now, for the first time, really address some of the questions related to synesthesia in a more scientific and rigorous and objective way. So now that the authenticity of synesthesia has been firmly established, there's a growing body of research dedicated to documenting the neurocognitive basis underlying synesthesia. And there's also a growing interest in broader traits associated with synesthesia, but which extend beyond the mere synesthetic experience itself. And I think this is a very, very interesting avenue and important part of research on synesthesia. It can really shed light on what synesthesia is and give us a fuller description of it. Also, studying perception from synesthesia's point of view can really shed light on how alterations in typical multisensory perceptual development can impact on very, very basic perceptual processing. So in this study, they had two groups of participants. One was synesthetes who experienced color as their concurrent, and the other one was a control group. And they used the color discrimination task, which, as you can see, consists of 4 different trays with distinctive color transformations. Each tray has between 23 and 24 color caps, which are very, very finely spaced in terms of hue, and they are all identical in luminance. So what happens is that the experimenter takes out all the color caps and arranges them on the table, but he leaves only the 2 color caps which represent 2 endpoints of the transformation. So for example, they would leave the yellow cap and the red cap, and they would ask participants to arrange the rest of the caps so that it represents a transformation from yellow through orange to red. And they have 2 minutes to do that. So So what they found was that synesthetes, and this is the dark blue bar, were much better at this task. They were much more accurate. They made fewer errors in comparison to non-synesthetes, which showed that they do indeed have superior color processing ability. And these stimuli, which is important to mention, they did not induce synesthesia in these people. Another study which I want to mention is a study done by Michael Banisi and colleagues in 2009, and they also used the same color discrimination task, and they also added another task. This is the tactile acuity task. So as you can see, there are different squares with gratings on them, and the experimenter presses those gratings on the participant's index finger and asks them to state if the gratings are oriented horizontally or vertically. The ridges of those gratings vary in width, so the greater the width, the easier the task is. And then at the end, they calculate a threshold, a tactile threshold, at which they would be expected to perform at 75% accuracy, which is a standard procedure. In this task, they had 4 different groups of participants. They had synesthetes who experienced color as their concurrent, synesthetes who experienced touch as their concurrent. In this case, it was a group of mirror touch synesthetes, so people who experience touch on their own body when they see other people being touched. There was a group of dual synesthetes, so they had both mirror touch synesthesia and color synesthesia. And there was also a group of non-synesthetes, so a control group. And what they found was that on the color perception task, the synesthetes who experienced color on its own, or dual synesthetes, performed much better on this task in comparison to synesthetes who have only mirror touch synesthesia or non-synesthetes. So having synesthesia for color, whether if it was on its own or in combination with some other forms of synesthesia, made them better at color perception task. And similarly on the tactile perception task, synesthetes who experience mirror touch synesthesia on its own, as well as dual synesthetes, outperformed non-synesthetes and synesthetes who only experience color as their concurrent, suggesting again that experiencing tactile concurrent makes them much more sensitive to touch in general. And again, these stimuli did not induce synesthesia in these participants. So the next study which I'm going to talk to you about is an EEG study, a neuroimaging study, where participants were shown different types of visual stimuli. And these visual stimuli can be processed or are processed in 2 different visual streams. So just to give you a very brief example of what each stream processes, the parvucellular stream processes high spatial frequency, so it's this one, high luminance contrast, as well as color stimuli. On the other hand, the magnocellular visual pathway processes low spatial frequency stimuli, low luminance, as well as motion. And they had 2 groups of people as well. They had control group and synesthetes who experienced color. And what they found was that there is increased responsiveness within the parvucellular pathway, and this is the pathway which processes color, amongst other things. And they also found a trend towards reduced responsiveness within the magnocellular pathway, which also processes motion. So it seems that this ability, the superior ability to process color, which has been previously documented in synesthesia for color, is reflected in hypersensitivity within the visual pathway involved in color processing. But at the same time, we have a reduction in magnocellular pathways, so it seems like maybe it comes at a cost. There's another study by Michael Banisi again. It was done in 2012, and that was a neuroanatomical study. They used voxel-based morphometry, VBM, which is a technique, it's an analysis of MRI scans of the brain, which can tell us more about the structural differences. And again, they had a group of synesthetes who experienced color and a group of non-synesthetes. And what they found was that there was an increased gray matter volume in area V4 of the brain, and this is the brain area processing color. And at the same time, they saw a reduction in gray matter volume in V5, which processes motion. So taking all these studies together, it seems that synesthesia for color is associated with increased or enhanced color processing, even for stimuli which do not induce synesthesia. And it seems to be reflected in this hyper-responsiveness within the areas of the brain involved in processing color. But then at the same time, we have this reduction in gray matter volume in area V5 and under-responsiveness within the visual pathway involved in processing motion. So what we wanted to see is if we would see any behavioral manifestations of that, whether synesthetes who experienced color would show reduction in motion perception abilities. So we did our experiment. We had two groups of participants, 10 female synesthetes who experienced color and 10 female controls, and they were matched for age. And we presented them with a random dot kinematogram. It's moving in real life. I don't have a movie here. So participants are shown an array of randomly moving dots. However, a proportion of them are moving coherently, always either to the left or to the right. And the participant's task is to indicate whether they can detect that coherent movement by pressing one of the two buttons, depending on if the movement is to the left or to the right. If they make a mistake, the task becomes easier, so the number of those coherently moving dots is increased. If they make a correct response, it becomes a bit more difficult. The number of coherently moving dots is decreased. But there is no feedback given to them at any point. So they saw 400 trials of this, and then we calculated coherence threshold at which they would be expected to perform at 75% accuracy again. And what we found was that synesthetes had elevated motion coherence thresholds, which means that they were pretty bad at this task in comparison to non-synesthetes. So it means they really had to have a greater number of those coherently moving dots in order to be able to detect them, which wasn't the case for non-synesthetes. And this was highly significant, statistically highly significant result. So you might be wondering now what looking at the randomly moving dots has anything to do with real life, and that's a fairly good question. We wanted to do this study just to see if we would have any behavioral manifestations of the neural differences that were shown by the previous studies, and this is exactly what we found. We need to do more studies. We need to see if we would obtain similar results at different speeds, faster speeds, as well as in response to biological motion, sort of more real life-like motion. But what I can say is that there is another condition which has deficits in motion perception at the same level, sort of very basic perceptual level, and it's dyslexia. So it would be interesting to see if there are any reductions in or any deficits in that respect in synesthesia for color. These findings are also very interesting in terms of studies on processes governing motion and color perception in non-synesthetes. So for example, there's a study by Vincent Walsh who used TMS, the non-invasive brain stimulation technique. And he applied, so you can apply TMS to any part of the brain to temporarily suppress its function. So this is what they did. They applied TMS to V5 area of the brain, which processes motion. They disrupted motion processing abilities, but at the same time, they enhanced color and form processing in those people. So what it really shows is that it seems that motion and color are competing for resources. And maybe in synesthesia for color, there is this prioritizing of color area over the motion area due to this extended exposure to color. So what I really wanted to show you today is that synesthesia is associated with wider perceptual traits which stretch beyond the mere presence of synesthesia itself. And that what we found in particular is that it is associated with deficits in motion perception abilities. And the sort of the main take-home message is that synesthesia can be associated or can have positive consequences for perception, like enhanced color processing, for example, but it can also result in negative consequences. And this study is part of a bigger project, which now has been accepted for publication, which will be available in Psychological Science, and this is the title of it. So I just wanted to thank the contributors, especially my PhD supervisor, Dr. Michael Banassi. And yes, if you have any questions, you can always email me if you want to take part in any experiments, although they are done in London, so it may be a bit tricky to get there. But we do have some online studies as well, so if you want to get in touch, please do. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much, Agnieszka, for sharing the results of your interesting research with us. Maybe right away I will open the discussion. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Chris? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, again, think of this from almost an evolutionary point of view, and it brings an interesting thing of, in what situations color would be preferable, or even color connected with other perception. And again, this idea, I keep thinking more and more about grapheme synesthesia, and that it's something that's the whole. Grapheme synesthesia implies you have to have graphemes, and for the vast majority of the human race, it's something that's only a few generations, maybe 10 generations old. I mean, we've had writing for 5,000 years, but it's something that was only a very, 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 very small elite until the 18th, 19th century. About the time that synesthesia was being discovered. And I don't know what the percentage is, but I think a huge percentage of synesthetes, at least that are non-synesthetes, are grapheme synesthetes. I just trying to think in evolutionary, but what would be, trying to think of some of the ideas that would maybe make a preference for or against synesthesia, or why,
why motion would be preferred over color, or why
color be preferred over motion?
Well, I'm not sure if this is the right question for me, really, but I would imagine that motion back, in the day would be more relevant, because if there was something coming at you, you'd probably have to be able to estimate how fast this thing is moving. Color may be a bit less. So I don't know where synesthesia really is coming here, but...
or does it have to do something with civilization?
Possibly. Possibly. I really can't answer this. Yeah.
I have maybe more a science fiction question relating to this relationship you have analyzed between motion perception and color perception. Is there, a phenomenon like seeing motion where it's not? Is it would it be possible to have cases where people see, let's say, motions in photography or something like this?
I've never heard of that, but obviously...
Neither did I, but as you did this connection, it would be interesting if it if you have a kind of, I mean, reverse case.
Of the sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. That's what you showed before, the picture. It's just a picture, and if you watch it or look at it, then it starts moving.
Yeah, that's
Is
true.
that what you meant?
No, because this would be, when I understood it rightly, was a question of objectively induced illusion, perception of illusion.
Yeah.
And so I speak here really in this sense, like non-forced seeing of motion, which would be different, I guess, as it comes as an extra animation talent. So.
Very different field.
So there's
But I mean, I guess you could, I don't know, I mean, obviously people who experience hallucinations, for example, in schizophrenia, I mean, they see things which are not there and also see things which are moving, but this is a bit maybe far-fetched, but it's possible. I mean, the brain can see things which are not there.
James, yeah.
So I'm sorry to present you with more things that isn't exactly your field, but I think it's actually a very curious thing with what you were talking about, with the emergence last year of the high frame rate films that are now being developed, and when all of my colleagues and I went and saw the new Hobbit film, which I don't recommend. There was a moment, because it's 48 frames per second instead of 24, and for all of us it was very strange, but we talked about it afterwards, and there was different moments when all of a sudden it didn't look strange anymore. And so what do we know about brains besides that we hopefully are using them? But it felt like there was a point where our brain was able to comprehend it. And I just was curious if there has been any discussion by people who actually understand how these things work about this new technology.
I'm not aware of it, but all I can say, I think, is that brains are extremely plastic and very, very adaptive. And so whatever you throw at them, they really sort of make sense of it somehow. Like we discussed yesterday, if you the sensory substitution devices, as long as you sort of provide input of the visual information to the brain, even if it's through the tongue or the back of your neck, it doesn't matter. It will make sense of it. And if you put sort of glasses on a person's eyes, which flip the image upside down, you're a little bit dizzy initially, but then I think after a few hours, the brain starts adapting and you begin to see it as normal. So it's extremely adaptive, extremely plastic. So I imagine with the increased number of frames, it's probably a fairly a simple task for it, to adapt to.
These other questions?
Thank you very much. This was really interesting. I have a question about, so since we don't really know what the implications for synesthesia would be, for synesthetes really would be if there is this motion processing, sort of decreased motion processing, but how does this decreased motion processing or affect people with dyslexia? I'm sure that probably there are results about that, so I'm just trying to figure out how that can impact a synesthete's life potentially.
It was more done as an association. So they took people with dyslexia and they did various tests on them, and it came out that they had deficits on those tasks of motion processing. And then they did some fMRI scans as well, and they did have abnormalities within the magnocellular pathway, the visual pathway processing motion. So it seems like there is a connection, there's a correlation, but it's not a causation, so who knows which direction it goes. Yeah.
Yes, it's not completely clear, like how...
It's not completely clear, no.
How it's going to affect, or how it affects, because people live with both synesthesia and
That's
dyslexia.
true, yeah. It would be interesting if there's a greater incidence of dyslexia amongst synesthetes. Or there's also studies on skilled readers, so people without dyslexia, but those who perform worse on the motion perception task. They do, I think they're slower at reading letters or this. So there is it's like a continuum probably, but there are deficits at different levels, also in skilled readers.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is really interesting. Thank you.
No problem.
So please. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is about color processing and motion processing competing for the same resources, as far as I understand.
That's correct, yep.
And I remember this case like very vaguely. A patient whose V5 was severely damaged, who had no motion perception. I think I read it in one of Ramachandran books, but yeah, she wasn't able to like see motion at all. She would just like see snapshots of images, and it was super hard for her to drink water, etc. So, is there any study on people whose V5 is severely damaged like that, to see if, you know, now that those resources are gone, V4 kind of takes over and there's like a superior or an emergence of a superior color perception? So that's question one. And the other one is about, you mentioned that there is like an inducer stimuli which, you know, results in this concurrent percept. Is there any like examples of, I don't know, synesthesia where, let's say, sound as an inducer, you know, concurs in motion? I can think of that myself because, you know, I think as my personal experience, certain, you know, sounds would like make me think of motions. Again, with color, maybe it's a little bit different. But is there any kind of like motion synesthesia? People who taste something and feel like they're moving a certain way.
There is a movement and color, I think, and sort of different, but movement can induce synesthesia, or different poses even. So there's different styles of swimming and color synesthesia, for example, which sounds very strange. That's all there is, really. There's a girl who's a synesthete, and she's a neuroscientist as well, and she's a swimmer. And she noticed that she just started getting those synesthetic experiences, and they were different depending on a style of swimming. And she would always get the same color depending on the type of the swimming style. So it was classified as a type of synesthesia because it's very consistent, I guess, and automatic and involuntary, as you would, you know, qualify other types of synesthesia. With regards to the first question, I don't think there has been any actually studies on that. The only one that, as I mentioned, I'm aware of is the one by Vincent Walsh, who did the brain stimulation or the suppression of the V5, and that resulted in increased color processing and form processing because they kind of tied together. But I'm not sure if it was done in patients with damaged V5, possibly.
Other questions? Yeah, please.
The question just came to my mind listening to the question before. It's more a general question. You know that the concept of or theory of complementarity was or the term complementarity was developed by William James, the American psychologist, not by Max Planck or Niels Bohr later in quantum physics, but in psychology at first. So you have maybe the idea that your research could lead to a point where you can see, okay, when we have with synesthetics maybe a strength or a deficit in one type of perception, there might be underdeveloped another kind of perception, that they could rise a system or some kind of network with an understanding of a complementarity behind. There's one kind of perception complementary to another, meaning that if one perception is strong, another could be maybe a little bit weaker, but as a strict duality.
I think this kind of sums up really what I wanted to show. This is, I think, I'm not aware of any other studies who have shown deficits in synesthesia. Most of the studies are showing that depending on the type of synesthesia, obviously, you've got enhanced color perception, enhanced tactile perception, greater empathy, a better ability to discriminate emotions. There's a link with enhanced memory, with creativity. And this seems to be the first study who says, but actually maybe it comes at a cost. And because of this link between motion and color in non-synesthetes, that's why we sort of addressed this question, and when we found that there is a deficit. So yes, maybe exactly there's this one whole, and if one takes over, then the other one suffers. But that remains to be answered really in the future.
Yeah, I got this point in your lecture, of course, but my question leads a little bit further, that whether this could fit into this concept of, or theory of complementarity at all. Because in physics, just to tell you that it's a strict relation. If you do a measurement, for instance, of energy and time, if you measure energy sharp, then you can measure time only with a certain with an uncertainty, and vice versa. But they are complementary Größen in physics, units. So this is strictly correlated. And my question is whether you see something that this might be for perception. This could be ordered maybe in a similar way.
It's really hard to tell. I think, first of all, because we don't really know what it means to have deficits in motion perception at this level. So I think we first need to find out how does it translate to real life. We also don't know if having hypoactivity within the motion parts of the brain means that there's less cells in there, or what is actually going on there? So we don't really know. So it's hard to tell really at this stage, but it's possible.
Okay, so please, Madi. And then Regina.
Just kind of about on that topic, about the deficits and relating to that. One thing I read quite a while ago is that often synesthetes, and this I think it was just general, I'm not sure if it was specifically colour, have a worse sense of direction. Now I don't know whether you've come across that, ever heard of that, or you know anything about it.
No, I'm sorry, I haven't actually come across it, no.
Okay. So
Do you know if it was a case study or it was a sort of pulled result?
I think it was, but I think maybe from quite a while ago, so I'm not really sure. And it was kind of just something in a book rather than reading an actual paper, so I don't really know the details of it.
I haven't heard of that.
No, okay. I was just wondering if it was related to the motion.
It could be, yes. Yes, definitely. motion and space and sort of moving in that space, it's all kind of related. So possibly, yeah. I think it would be interesting to actually address it.
Yeah.
Everything, yeah. It's all kind of linking, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, it'd be interesting. And are you, in terms of working out what the real world deficit might be in terms of that, is that your next stage?
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
I wanted to ask you, in terms of this idea of having an interdisciplinary forum, and you represent the science and kind of case studies and research, what can scientists learn from the different interdisciplinary voices and perspectives on this subject?
Well, I think science and art are very, very much interlinked, especially when it comes to synesthesia. Like I said before, there's one study actually, also done by Jamie Ward. He seems to have done most studies on synesthesia, which shows that there's a link between synesthesia and creativity, but that hasn't been replicated actually, so we don't really know. But synesthetes are obviously more involved in arts, and than non-synesthetes. But I think it's very informative for both, for all disciplines really. And art and the techniques that are used in art are very often similar to experimental procedures used in psychology. A number of examples that were presented here, it really sounded like, you know, stuff that we do in the lab. It's just that we're looking for different things. We're focusing on different things. So there's a different sort of goal, but it's quite similar actually. So it's very informative and quite inspirational.
So Yesu?
Maybe I can follow your discussion psychologically or psychophysically. However, I am afraid that to connect such discussion directly to the neurobiological interpretation of V5 and V4, because we know that if we are using as stimuli only the motion, then V5 is activated. However, if we are using color stimuli, then not only V4, but also at the same time, V5 is also activated, because I guess so that the changing of color is also a part of the motion. So there is some problem to the interpretation of current motion in psychology and neurobiology. And if you have any argumentation for that, so I want to ask you.
So color and motion, I mean, the visual information, the visual image is processed initially at on very, very basic level when it comes to V1. And then different parts of the visual system are sort of interested in different bits of that visual system. V5 is predominantly interested in motion, and V4 is predominantly interested in color. They do other things as well, but they really are specialized for that. And then at the end, it all kind of comes together, and you get this one, you know, vision of the world, which has a lot of layers.
You know, what I want to ask you is not such so basic thing of the neurobiological thing, but my question is actually I have used MRI, no, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and so if I have investigated the moving of colors. And also the not only the moving of the colors, but also the changing of the colors. It has not been moved, only changed. However, V5 is also activated at the same time of the activation of V4. Mm-hmm. So it means that actually we cannot divide the perception of color and motion. So it was my question.
But wouldn't you expect V4 to be activated to a greater degree in response to color?
There was, sorry, my bad English. There was, so at least there was a discussion that color and motion perception can be divided in the visual cortex. However, so there was, my argumentation is the changing of color can be also perceived as a motion. Okay, I understand. Mm-hmm. And so it means that if you are discussing not only about the motion or color, if you try to connect or to argument the connection or relation of color and motion, then you cannot ignore such phenomena. And how can I say, the connection of V4 and V5, no?
I'm not denying that there's an overlap between different brain areas processing different aspects of visual information. But I think this is a more complex and another thing that possibly we have to address to see if movement of color is, you know, how this affects the brain or how it's processed in the brain. But I think what we wanted to show that there is a qualitative difference between the brains of synesthetes and non-synesthetes in response to the same stimulus, which in this case was just moving dots. But yeah, we possibly could do that with that type of stimuli as well.
So maybe the last question on this side.
Yeah. What a wonderful brain we have. you were talking about the swimmer, and according to what Maddie said before about motions and colors, until now, I'm the only one I know who is almost have a complete lack of a sense of right and left and up and down and so. But ask me where the number one is. It's always on the left. I'm totally sure of that. But ask me the street next door. I can't tell you. And so it possibly some connection. I have wondered.
So you have number form as well, number
yes,
line around
yes,
you.
yes.
So that's really interesting because maybe your number line is helping you to orient yourself in space.
It helped me sometimes if the number is related to what I'm doing. But don't ask me to ask me after the toilet. I usually use days to find it in the same building. So
it's very, very interesting, and it does link to that idea of maybe motion deficits and spatial awareness, problems with spatial awareness. I think that should be really pursued further because I'm not aware if it has been done beyond that study that you mentioned, but it is very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we'll close the panel now. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Agnieszka.